in this episode?
So there's a long history in 20th century philosophy of science of investigating the possibility of something like an automated science or a formalized science or a algorithmically implemented science, all aspects of science, including sort of uncovering theory. And this has been a rich tradition, but it's been strictly abstract about hypothetical machines and hypothetical algorithms and hypothetical forms of automation of scientific labor, right? And all of a sudden, sort of perhaps largely unanticipated by philosophers, we reach a point where, boom, deep learning revolution, and suddenly there is a kind of massive shift towards taking aspects of scientific discovery and passing them off to a intelligent computational system, right? And I think there's been kind of a tendency to continue to view that within the lens of this automation of scientific discovery debate as it's existed, without really attending to the details of how these technologies are in fact being implemented in scientific practice. And by the way, I think when what we are doing is collecting data from some system in the world and using some machine learning model to extract statistical patterns from that system in order to learn about that system, what we're doing is effectively science. It follows the model of science. So in fact, most applications of machine learning ought to be considered a kind of science adjacent activity, and in my opinion, held to the standards of good science.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the philosopher of science, Mel Andrews, who's doing work in machine learning and other adjacent fields such as the philosophy of mathematics, epistemology, and of course AI ethics. It was a fantastic, cordial, and riveting conversation for me. And I should first say, it's good to be back. It's good to be back after my short holiday, back doing podcasts, having these fascinating conversations with these superlative guests, and I couldn't think of a better person to start off with other than Mel. They is fascinating. They also has this way of kind of elucidating certain points that for a while I did struggle to understand, and of course. Probably the best example would be this paper, "The Math is Not the Territory: Navigating the Free Energy Principle." As someone who's deeply interested in the kind of the philosophy of FEP, this paper really helped me understand what the ontology of the free energy principle is and what really is the proper way to view it as a kind of a mathematical, formalistic, conceptual framework that can be applied in many areas, such as machine learning and, of course, cognitive science. But we did start the podcast discussing Mel's recent paper regarding the epistemic status of machine learning. And they provocatively claimed that machine learning has a pseudoscience problem, which I vehemently agree with, and even kind of brought up this resurgence of physiognomy kind of provocatively to make this point. It's a preprint, in fact, and we discussed a bit of that paper and kind of extrapolated some of those ideas into the broader socio-political discussion around AI ethics, which again is very interesting. And I do really appreciate that Mel does a very critical, almost Foucauldian analysis of these different disciplines that are getting a lot of attention these days, such as AI and machine learning, of course. I also mentioned to Mel that this Twitter feed is a place that I visit quite often online. I hate Twitter. I think Twitter is a hellscape. However, there are a few accounts that I've bookmarked, and I do frequently visit simply for entertainment, but also to learn. And Mel's Twitter feed is certainly one of those that I've bookmarked. Having said that, before I get carried away talking about Twitter and all of that, a bit of a formal introduction to Mel Andrews. Mel Andrews is a philosopher of science working on the role of mathematical and computational methods in science, in particular machine learning based methods. Mel is currently a predoctoral research associate at the Department of Machine Learning at the Carnegie Mellon University and doing a PhD in philosophy of science at the University of Cincinnati. They are also a visiting scholar at the Australian National University and the University of Pittsburgh. Having said that, here's my conversation with Mel Andrews. Also, on a housekeeping note, I should mention that I'll leave links to everything we've discussed in the show notes. Okay, now to the podcast.
The sort of conclusion I reached eventually was it just, I mean, in academia, there's a certain portion of what you do that feels like running on a wheel. Like it's a performance. It's not actually to accomplish anything, but it just feels like such a high percentage of that in industry is just sort of,
Yeah.
there's so many levels of removal. The person who's passing down the orders is so many levels removed from the people actually implementing solutions that you're almost not accomplishing anything.
Yeah. Also, like, I mean, look, I think Franz Kafka, he captured it best in his novel. It's Kafkaesque in the sense that it seems like people are just doing things for the sake of doing things without really going anywhere, and like you're
Yeah,
having all these, wanky meetings. But to be fair though, like I agree with you because I'm still outside of academia. I've kind of idealized academia, but after talking to a lot of people like yourself and on the podcast, I'm getting a more realistic picture of what it is. Because at the end of the day, the university is still in our society. It's a part of our culture within the
and
media.
it's beholden to a capitalist economic system.
Exactly. Yeah. And it kind of shows how much let's call it the capitalist tentacles reach into every corner of our social existence. I mean, although I even go a step further and I say, I mean, I'm a big fan of Zizek. It even changes our psyche, our subjective state in this world, and like fundamentally who we are as let's say beings in this world, and that of course affects academics and quote unquote lay people and everyone really. But I see what you mean. Yeah. So I've got
In
to
terms of
ask
the
now though.
AI,
Go ahead.
sorry,
Go
in
ahead.
terms of even like the AI ethics communities, you have like the AI risk, AI safety people,
Mm,
so
mm.
like existential risk, kind of the effective altruist oriented community, and you've got then academic fairness, safety, regulation communities. And they're both sort of pointing at each other and accusing each other of like corporate capture. But of course, the irony is that these communities are both about as corporately captured as you can get.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, every entity really in a neoliberal society is corporate captured in some sense. After the 70s and 80s, it fundamentally changed. I completely agree with you.
No ethical work, no ethical consumption.
I mean, there's only really a handful of I'd say at this point, as in some sense, I'm like, well, I am a neophyte, but I'd say there's only a handful of researchers who I follow quite closely. You certainly being one of them, and then Ines and a few others, because as in for me, this whole question about AI ethics and yeah, AI safety. I only find it to be useful when we kind of got it more from the, let's call it the ontological level of like what is AI, what is machine learning as we have it now, and kind of starting at like that very fundamental level, ontological level, as you've done, in some of your papers, because for me that gives a lot more I hate to use this term because it's kind of cheap, but like realistic view of where we are with machine learning and AI and where we can go.
Yeah, or even
Yeah.
you know, sticking to the realm of not what is conceivable. I mean, I think there's a lot of discourse happening at the level of what is conceivable, what sorts of technologies are conceivable, or what sorts of technologies are metaphysically possible, or what have you. And it's like, well, let's think about what might come into being in the reality we occupy, because what comes into being in the reality we occupy is governed by market forces.
Correct.
And we should think about technologies that some person might conceivably be incentivized and capacitated to build. If there are technologies that no one would ever be incentivized and capacitated to build, realistically speaking, I don't think there's much point in debating what their capabilities are or what the dangers emerging from these technologies would be. And I think there's a lot of debate that's happening at that level without considering, incentives. And truthfully, I think this is, again, the primary sort of axis of opposition in the AI ethics communities or community is between the risk safety people and the sort of fairness responsible AI people, fact community, etc. And maybe the failing point of both of these communities is in their scholarship a total failure, at least in the major part of the work, to really consider incentive structures. So the interventions we're suggesting have to be able to work within incentive structures as they exist or they might conceivably exist. They have to consider how we might, if the point is to manipulate incentive structures, we have to have that conversation explicitly. How are we intending that the intervention we suggest would nudge incentive structures as they exist? And I think there's just sort of a failure to consider that in large part in a lot of the work falling under the aegis of AI ethics writ as largely and abstractly as we possibly can, right?
Undoubtedly. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a very straightforward thing, but AI doesn't sit in a silo. It's always within it sits within a psychosocial reality. I couldn't agree more.
Which is deeply complex to the point that it having to think through incentive structures feels like it makes any problem in this realm completely intractable. So I
Yeah,
get
I
avoidance,
agree. Yeah,
but
although I want to add, which is where I again like what you're doing, and we'll certainly get to this in a bit. Uh, kind of trying to understand, which is why for me, I think only a philosopher of science, and perhaps even someone with a bit of a background in sociology, uh, can kind of explore the kind of the epistemic status of what is machine learning or what is AI in contemporary times, and then maybe speculate and theorize on where it could go and develop in the future. Because I'm going to be honest, again, as more of an outsider, some of this sounds a lot like science fiction to me, and I'm kind of like, but are we really even discussing as to what the current models are? What are large language models? Like, what do they really do without all of this speculation? Which again, the speculation seems just like it's just a bunch of blokes having fun without considering all the factors that you mentioned, our psychosocial reality, where is AI incentive structure, kind of the symbolic network that all comes together, which it is a seems like an intractable problem. I agree. Yeah.
but I mean, I think a lot of philosophy is self-gratifying in a sense.
Oh, for sure. Oh my God. I mean, I would say a lot of thinking in general. Yeah, yeah. I'd say a big part
Well,
of
so I
it is for that. It's for because it's self-gratifying, not for any ethical
yeah, I mean,
virtue
I
aims.
think
That's a
I
good.
have a very sort of like pragmatic embodied view of thinking, and a sort of a very I think that goes into a sort of pragmatic ethical or political stance as well, where I think we think in order to effect action in the world. Thinking, I don't think thought takes place. I don't think we can say cognition has really taken place unless we see the hallmarks of it in behavior. So, I mean, I actually think I'm a sort of weird behaviorist in the sense that I think that consciousness and sentience and agency and cognition and a lot of sort of what's been considered unobservable mental characteristics are actually readable from behavioral dynamics.
Mm.
And I think that we should not be thinking of philosophy as an idle pursuit. It impacts the way we go about the world, or it ought to be approached as though it's going to have immediate impact on how we interact with the phenomena it treats as its subject matter.
Yeah.
I'm just saying I'm fully a pragmatist with respect
Yeah,
to.
and I get your point. Also, like, I mean, not only as a pragmatist, but I would even say, I've been deeply interested in psychoanalysis, and I've spoken to heaps of psychoanalysts. And one misunderstanding I think a lot of people have, coming from like the Carl Jung type, is like the idea of depth psychology, where they think the truth of a person's desires and motives are somewhere deep within, and you need like a psychoanalyst to find it. But the flip is the Freudian, more Lacanian idea is no, 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 that the truth lies in your actions. The truth is never like deep within. Rather, it's very conspicuous. It's out there, hey, and you can see it in how people act and how people engage in their social world. So I can see
Nothing is really
where you're
hidden.
going with that.
Yeah.
Not that's the ultimately you come to realize nothing is really hidden. Yeah, yeah. All right, Mel. So you've been working on a few papers, kind of working on the epistemic status of machine learning, which I've thoroughly enjoyed reading and learned a lot. One of them was this paper I read. I read this a while back, which is the machine learning and the theory-free ideal. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. But also the recent preprint you shared with me, which I thought was a very good, provocative piece, in fact, titled "Ghosts in the Machine Learning." The reanimation of pseudoscience and its ethical repercussions. So, to perhaps to orient the listeners, if you could kind of give us an introduction as to, yeah, what is this work you're doing researching the epistemic status of machine learning, apropos philosophy of science, and then perhaps you know as carrying on from our AI ethics conversation or chat, how those two ideas are connected, the epistemic status of machine learning, and then what's its relationship to AI ethics.
Yeah. So there's a long history in 20th century philosophy of science of investigating the possibility of something like an automated science or a formalized science or a algorithmically implemented science, all aspects of science, including sort of uncovering theory. Um, and this has been a rich tradition, but it's been strictly abstract about hypothetical machines and hypothetical algorithms and hypothetical forms of automation of scientific labor, right? And all of a sudden, sort of perhaps largely unanticipated by philosophers, we reach a point where, boom, deep learning revolution. And suddenly there is a kind of massive shift towards taking aspects of scientific discovery and passing them off to a intelligent computational system, right? And I think there's been kind of a tendency to continue to view that within the lens of this automation of scientific discovery debate as it's existed, without really attending to the details of how these technologies are in fact being implemented in scientific practice. And by the way, I think when what we are doing is collecting data from some system in the world and using some machine learning model to extract statistical patterns from that system in order to learn about that system, what we're doing is effectively science. It follows the model of science. So in fact, most applications of machine learning ought to be considered a kind of science adjacent activity, and in my opinion, held to the standards of good science. Now, I think that there's a lot of good work being done with machine learning in science. There's a lot of really epistemically careful work. And I think there's also, like with most things, a glut of garbage. Pick a genre of anything. I don't care if it's films or psychological studies or books on the history of hip hop or like whatever it is.
Or perhaps even people for that matter.
Yeah, most of
Garbage
it's
people.
crap.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a very small percentage of it that's quite good. Machine learning is no different. There's a lot of good work being done and 1,000-fold more bad work being done. The issue is that it's being adopted so rapidly. These methods are being adopted so rapidly in so many contexts across society. Most people don't understand how the technology works. There's a lot of AI hype. As long as there has been AI, there has been AI hype. And what hype is I think it should be made explicit that what hype is it's a targeted disinformation campaign. It
Okay.
is,
Okay. Yeah. Perhaps you could, elaborate on what you mean by that.
yeah, so AI hype refers to people when Sam Altman says we'll have AGI by X, or when Sam Altman says, well, GPT-3 could take a 20-minute activity and reduce it to a 5-minute activity, but GPT next will reduce a week-long activity to 5 minutes or something like that. That's AI hype.
Now, I saw a
Um,
recent statement by, I believe, anyway, I don't want to mention any names, that the next GPT model will be able to replace PhD researchers, and we won't need any PhD researchers anymore. So, yeah, I mean, sure.
That's AI hype. Scientists and science popularizers saying the theorist will be replaced, the physicist will be replaced, the doctor will be replaced. People, in medical context, saying, "Oh, we won't need secretaries or we won't need nurses anymore." Um, any of that genre, but it also includes the doomerism about AI, like soon AI will surpass human intelligence and it will, hurt
Yeah,
us
that's
somehow.
the part which for me at least, feels a lot like science fiction, if I'm being honest. The doom and
Yeah.
yeah. There's something even, it's interesting to even
They're all
sci-fi.
a bit science fiction. I mean,
Yeah. And I have nothing against, I love science fiction, but it's got its own status in our dialogue, right? I mean, science
yeah.
fiction, it's called fiction
But
for a reason.
saying that's some particular tech breakthrough is going to replace uh cardiologists even is absolutely. Will it, have some impact on the role of cardiologists and specifically how they approach analyzing the results of imaging, right? Totally. Is it going to replace cardiologists? No, that's science fiction, right?
And it
And so,
probably should, given all technology affects how we do our jobs, how we live our lives, and that's completely fine. It probably should affect how they
right,
do their job. Yeah.
if it works, it should.
That's
If it
true.
doesn't work, it should be canned.
Yeah.
But if it works, it should have an impact. It's just that there's in anything that's, marketable, there's an incentive to misrepresent what it does. This is true of, you can pull out a magazine from 1952 and how it advertises some cooking implement to stay-at-home moms. And it misrepresents, it's like, this is a life-changing, it's going to lie to you about what the thing does, right? But with AI specifically, I think there's to some extent, even the average housewife in the 1950s was like, yeah, probably not all of this about the oven is actually the ground truth, Whereas with AI, people seem to be willing to believe really radically untrue things, just things that are actually, to anyone in the know, blatant lies. But there's a culture of really leaning into highly fabulous lies, propagating them to no end, and no one seems to be doing fact checking. And the worst part to me is I would think that's so I'm coming from this position of history and philosophy of science, where it's like, we've studied hundreds and hundreds of years of science and technology and how people misrepresent what it does and what it actually does, right? So I would hope that we would have a critical lens on this. And it strikes me that there's a lot of philosophy that's simply parroting or lending kind of philosophical justification to these hype narratives that, deep learning will radically change the face of particle physics or something like that. It's like, really? Really though?
Yeah. Okay, perhaps this is a good place to go to. So, one term which I really liked in the paper which you used was this idea of called the theory-free ideal. I really like that term because I think for me that captures what, apropos philosophy of science, or let's say apropos the scientific method, what the hope or the dream with the ML models are. So if you could, Mel, just to like again to flesh this out a bit more, as to where we are right now with the current paradigm of machine learning, what is the epistemic status of machine learning? And then could you then probably connect that to what is this theory-free ideal? And then, as you point out in your papers, what are the mistakes that people make by having this ideal of science being theory-free when done with a let's say an ML model, for instance?
Yeah. So I think machine learning models are statistical models that are computationally instantiated. There's nothing that would in principle make the epistemic status of these technologies any different from any kind of other statistical model. Now, you're pushing yourself into really high dimensional spaces in which data is transposed. And so there's intrinsically the dimensionality of the patterns you're finding is much higher than what you're doing with classical statistics. But I guess I doubt that when people are doing multiple regression, they are kind of holding all the dimensions in their head in the way that they would have to be in order for the contrast that's typically drawn between deep learning and classical statistics to make sense. Like there's meant to be a kind of opacity, a kind of intrinsic deep unknowability of the kinds of patterns that these statistical methods, that is deep learning methods, are finding relative to classical statistical methods. And I just don't see that distinction being substantive and absolute in the way that it's proposed to be. I think these are at their heart statistical methods like other statistical methods, And if there's a difference, it's a sociological difference.
Okay, I
It's
think I followed you all the way except the last bit, the sociological bit. If you could probably flesh that
yeah,
out.
so it's the corporatization of these
Oh, I
technologies.
see. I see. Okay.
It's the hype narrative. So even in a research context, there's because machine learning, I mean, uh, uh, because machine learning is this place where stats met up with AI, and AI is something that's always AI refers to a lot of different research traditions that have had historically very little to do with each other in terms of their substance, in terms of their subject matter, in terms of the methods. They mostly have to do with where funding is being targeted and the kinds of narratives spun around these research methods. So there's very little substantive that holds everything that's historically been called AI, going back to cybernetics, going back to McCarthy, going back to,
All the way to Alan Turing, perhaps.
Napoleon Pitts, and, like going back all through the history of things being called artificial intelligence. There's very little that connects all of these, but who they're targeting for funding and the kinds of narratives they're using in convincing the public and funding bodies of what they're doing. So there are methods and statistics that have been, approaching something like machine learning, going back 80s, 90s, whatever, right? But where that meets up with the AI narrative, you get this hype and disinformation and overselling of competence, right? And so there's an attitude and a meta narrative surrounding machine learning that is, I think, more what sets it apart from classical statistics than anything else. This is a spicy take. I kind of, with a grain of salt, but this is my challenge is really like, tell me what is so radically epistemically different about these technologies that they should be placed in some category that's discrete from classical statistics. I have not seen it,
And you point this out, yeah, and also I guess it's this meta narrative that drives, it's the impetus behind this theory-free ideal when it comes to
Yeah,
science.
and there's been, so philosophers, natural philosophers, scientists have debated what theory is and what its proper role in science is since the incipience of what we call modern science, right? Since Bacon and Newton and Galileo, modern science, right? Even going back to Bacon, there's a kind of push for a kind of radical empiricism that pushes away as much as possible the role of theory. About just tabulating as much data as possible and sifting through it for patterns and not bringing our kind of conceptual infrastructure to bear on it. But then since Hume brought his sort of problem of induction
Induction,
to the
yeah.
table in epistemology, there's this widespread recognition that, well, all knowledge of the natural world is knowledge by induction. You do not get deductive certainty about empirical matters.
Yeah.
All
So for
knowledge of
instance, the
what
sun
exists.
rising. Yeah. So the
Yeah.
typical example is the sun rising. Just because it rose yesterday, we can't say necessarily it'll
Every day of our lives, the sun has risen in the morning.
has risen. Yeah, yeah.
And yet, give me a deductive proof, give me logical certainty that it will rise tomorrow. There is none. There's only the the remit of our experience to tell us that it will rise tomorrow. There's no logical necessity that it will rise again tomorrow. So knowledge of nature, scientific knowledge is, and all our kind of day-to-day practical knowledge, like I can eat this bread and it won't poison me because the bread I ate yesterday that I got from the same baker didn't poison me, this is inductive knowledge, which means we don't get deductive certainty.
Hmm.
And it also means that to get that kind of knowledge, you need to start off with rich conceptual infrastructure, which I'm calling theory. I think there are lots of ways that philosophers have traditionally cashed out what we mean by theory. I think that when we talk about theory-free science, we mean a powerful influence at the beginning of inquiry, at the beginning of the investigatory procedure of our prior conceptual resources, our prior conceptual acquaintance with the target phenomena, right? We do not get inductive inference off the ground without bringing to bear prior theory or conceptual inference. The philosopher and historian of science John Norton calls it bring to bear material facts, right? But there are lots of ways of putting it, but you need theory to get empirical knowledge off the ground. And so in this sense, you cannot have theory-free knowledge of natural systems. And I think that you can look back for hundreds of years, and there's always this dialogue between, no, we should get rid of as much as we can push away the influence of prior conceptualization. We should do that, and that's scientific objectivity. This is, I think, one notion of scientific objectivity, right, that has been kind of implicitly in the background of a lot of discourse in philosophy, natural philosophy, science for hundreds of years. And then another stream that says, well, you can't actually have knowledge of nature without bringing conceptual resources to bear. So it's about documenting them. It's about recognizing them. It's about, to some extent, working backwards from those assumptions and saying which of those assumptions are in fact substantiated by what we've then been able to observe and deduce from what we've measured or observed in nature, right? And what is in fact just arbitrary or unknown, right? And I think since the rise of domain generic statistical methods in the 20th century, in particular, stats really gets off the ground after the axiomatization of probability theory with Kolmogorov. Statistical reasoning, probabilistic reasoning is to the extent that it's so widespread in science, it's relatively new. It's really a kind of 20th century, like statistical reasoning is kind of a 20th century thing. I mean, it sort of got off the ground with gambling and stuff in the 17th century, but as a scientific method, it's new. And really, I think since the mid 20th century, you get a lot of this what I call a theory-free ideal. And it's in the kind of fundamental, I don't know if I believe in this designation, but in the more fundamental sciences who know how to theorize because they've been doing it for hundreds of years and know how to mathematically represent their phenomena because they've been doing it for hundreds of years, you get less of this. But in the younger sciences, like the quantitative social sciences, like social psychology, like population genetics, what have you, economics, there's this belief that the more theory-free, the more data-driven the methods are, the more objective they are, and the more sciencey.
Yeah, so when you mean the more fundamental, you mean like physics, for instance, right?
Yeah, areas of, but not all areas of physics, right? The areas of physics that are really established.
Yeah, although this beautifully connects with your sociological point, because I'm sure you're aware of the whole Bohr-Einstein debate and the, shut up and calculate. There's like a lot of in the history of 20th century physics, there's this idea that even within physics, you shouldn't ask, well, given that physics it's a foundational discipline, the ontology of the physical world. There was a time, especially because of World War II and the nukes and all that, just don't ask the ontological questions, just shut up and calculate. just that there's the ruthless pragmatism, ruthless just create. And so physics kind of sometimes, and again, I again say this as a bit of an outsider, it becomes a bit more like engineering or a foundational discipline where you're asking, well, what exists, what is
That was sort
reality?
of the Los Alamos attitude, right?
As in the idea that physics is engineering. I'm
The shut up and calculate attitudes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know more from the Copenhagen school. I mean, I followed that. I think Tim Maudlin, he speaks quite well about that. And I just like it's like a interesting peculiarity in the history of physics, especially because if you look at the big figures like the Einsteins, or like the Maxwells, they were deeply interested in these philosophical questions. It's like what exists, like it's
Well,
not.
Einstein was a philosopher.
He certainly was. He certainly was, without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, he probably after Newton is probably the quintessential natural philosopher. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, so I mean, just on this note, I couldn't read the paper too carefully, but I do love the. Perhaps it's worth mentioning because it's rather provocative, and I like that a bit. Where you say, yeah, machine learning has a pseudoscience problem, and then you bring up the well, you and the other writers, Andrew and Abiba, is it? Yeah, bring up
And
the
in a
yeah. They bring up the idea of how there's a resurgence of physiognomy uh, in kind of these ML communities. So just if you could just humor me with that for a bit, just kind of what all that's about, why you claim machine learning has a pseudoscience problem, which I think you already kind of did outline quite in detail. But then this little example you use on physiognomy.
Yeah, well, part of it is this sort of runaway idea that we can do science without theory that picks up steam in the mid-century, and then with the rise of machine learning techniques and these being adopted widely, it just it gets bundled into this hype narrative about how these technologies work, and then everyone sort of believes that these technologies are capable of extracting true knowledge of some natural system in virtue of having achieved high classifier accuracy on some natural data set, right? And what's actually happening is researchers are interpreting that pattern as having discovered precisely whatever their intuitive idea of what they were going to discover was beforehand. Because if they're not explicitly doing the theory, if they're not explicitly theorizing, then they're implicitly theorizing, which means that they're effectively trying to con you into believing whatever their intuitions were at the start of the research procedure without effectively having furnished evidence of that, besides having told you that they trained some model and there's some pattern in the data that satisfied some criteria, right, for success. But I think because of all these hype narratives surrounding machine learning, and again, not for substantive epistemic differences in how these statistical methods work, but rather for sociological reasons, you get a lot of bad science.
Mm.
So if I want to do a quantitative social science study and I'm in a sociology department or an economics department, my advisors won't let me do that until I've read up on the 100 years long history of scientists in my field having studied that exact problem, right? Machine learners, on the other hand, machine learners don't even read the history of their own work. Like it is not typical for someone in machine learning to have even a 5 years deep understanding of the history of their own field, right? Which is, there are of course exceptions, but the general rule is people in machine learning do not read
Yeah, and
history.
so, but
Right.
are you talking about more on the scientific side, or do you just mean general, commercial ML engineers,
Practitioners, but also
practitioners,
in academic
academics. Okay, interesting.
setting,
That's unfortunate.
right?
Yeah.
And so when you go to apply ML, everything that's submitted to IEEE or NeurIPS or what have you, ACM, you get just this glut of work of people applying the methods of ML, especially DL, to some problem that scientists have spent maybe hundreds of years working on. And there's no acknowledgement that what they're attempting to tackle is a scientific problem that some very specific field of, molecular biomechanicists or whatever the field is, right, have been working on for hundreds of years. And then there's this attitude that, well, deep learning will solve the problem and I don't have to pay my dues and read about the methods in this field. And then the reviewing practices at, well, part of it is like we got rid of traditional peer review in machine learning, which is like, was traditional peer review hopelessly broken? Yes. Did we introduce new problems by getting rid of it wholesale? Also, yes. Right. And so then you've got, so there aren't standard journals in machine learning the way there are in biomechanics or biochemistry or socioeconomics or whatever, right? You are submitting to the big name machine learning conferences, but peer review there is, I mean, I have to say it's pretty radically uncommon. I don't know that I don't think anyone who reviews for or submits to machine learning venues would try to fight me on that. I mean, I think the consensus is that the peer review process for these venues is wildly inadequate.
Inadequate, yeah. So
And it's because when you apply machine learning, right, you're applying it to some domain. You're applying it to some domain where there is a vast history of people trying to solve some problem. And when you submit your little deep learning thing to IEEE, and you're trying to tackle some problem in social science, they're not asking social scientists to review that. God, no. Right? They're asking other people who trained a, transformer with data of that shape, right? But they're not asking people who have the disciplinary knowledge to review the methods for what actually matters to doing science, right?
yeah, yeah. And when do you think this changed? Well, is this imminent to the practice itself, or when do you think this change took place where the peer reviewing method became a bit lax or inadequate, as you pointed out?
Well, it was just sort of an organic thing, right? You have, on the one hand, I mean, it was never the case that there were people applying machine learning. As far as I'm aware, it was never the case that people were applying machine learning to some problem in biology and then submitting that to a biojournal. That's not I mean, occasionally that happens, right? But that's not standard practice, and I don't think it ever was. It was also not the case that there were kind of standard there were standard journals for stats, right? But there were never kind of standardized deep learning journals, right? There were computing or stats conferences that got that kind of evolved into ML specific conferences, or new ML specific conferences emerged. And like, a lot of the main ones are actually, they didn't start out as ML conferences and they evolved to be ML conferences. but also you have at the same time the emergence of pre-printing servers. And so as you get the emergence of a new kind of, like, machine learning, the methods we call machine learning have been around since like the 80s, right? You could trace it back earlier to kind of proto machine learning methods. Those go back much. I mean, again, like it was out of World War II, it was out of the research at Los Alamos that you got like MCMC sampling, right? Like Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling, like Metropolis Hastings
Yeah. Okay.
sampling
I
algorithms,
didn't,
right? Like,
I didn't know that. Yeah.
yeah, it goes back to like the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s.
So even before.
That's kind of machine learning, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but you know, machine learning it's the early 2000s that machine learning kind of goes like, hey, we're a scientific field, or hey, we're an engineering discipline. Like we're a discipline now, right? And it's at the same time that you're getting pre-printing servers as the sort of way that stuff is disseminated. So there's effectively there's no incentives to start journals, and there's incentive against starting journals, I would say. I'm making this up on the spot, but that's kind of how I would reconstruct that history.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's partially contingent. It's just historically how things have
Yeah,
been.
and also there's this widespread recognition that there's something deeply broken about traditional peer review, which is true.
Yeah. Which virtually, I believe every academic I've spoken to has said that. So unequivocally, I think it's just a general consensus. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Now that's great, Mel. I want to be cognizant of the time, which is why I want to get to this. And I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm flattering you, but your paper on the free energy principle, it is. I've probably read it like 3 or 4 times, and I think I can probably parrot out certain parts of it verbatim because I've read it so many times, especially
Yeah,
because
I hate it. It's a really good paper.
it's a fantastic paper. It's a fantastic.
And so now I'm like, okay, what, you know, I'm trying to write a subsequent paper, and it's like it's not that good.
I mean, because like it's probably your most cited paper, right? I mean, I found you through
Yeah.
this paper, in fact. Like I didn't even know who you were until I came across this work. Yeah, so just for the listener, it's called The Math is Not the Territory, Navigating the Free Energy Principle. Yeah, I mean, it's philosophically interesting. It's got so much into like the history of science, and then like what is formalization. You speak about the structure, like yeah, heaps a lot to discuss here. Although before we get to the, let's say, the nitty gritty, and one thing I want to mention is, so I've been trying to get through this book on active inference, and I've got to say, because when I'm reading this, every page I'm kind of reading it in a way through the kind of the lens of what you put in me through this paper. It's like I've got a bias now. I've got the math is not the territory bias, because
Because I've infected you.
because it really helped me understand. Yeah, it really did help me understand the ontology of what really is the free energy principle, because it's got so much interest. So many people talk about it, and Carl Friston, he's fantastic. I've learned so much, but he sometimes isn't the best elucidator. Like when it comes to
Well, he's not a
explaining
philosopher.
correct. I think that could be the reason.
Einstein was a philosopher. Carl Friston is like Isaac Newton in that he's kind of like, I don't care what's, like, he'll assent to any metaphysics. Newton would assent to any. Newton was like, I'm not doing metaphysics. I'm
Mm,
associating relationships I see in data.
mm.
Right, but don't tell me about the physical seat of gravity. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that certainly wasn't a dig at for Professor Friston, because he himself says, yeah, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist, and I don't really even he doesn't even really take a philosophical position or metaphysical position pertaining to the FEP. But having said that, Mel, so. Oh, sorry. Be that as it may, I mean, why do you think there's such deep philosophical interest in the free energy principle? Like any philosopher who works in the philosophy of biology or the cognitive scientist or ML, but it's such deep philosophical interest. So, yeah, why do you think the reason for that is?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One of them is, okay, so I think of all math, all applied mathematics, all scientific math or models as a kind of thinking tool. Math is a thinking tool for
Hmm.
science, right? But the free energy principle is a thinking tool in a different way, in that it's not actually meant to be placed in contact with empirical data, right? It's just about enabling us to conceptualize of target phenomena in new ways. Um, and it happens to be new ways that are actually really philosophically generative and novel to some degree. Um, Not exactly novel, but overlooked. I mean, you get some of like some of what's being said about life. It's, if you look hard enough, it's really in Schrodinger's Erwin Schrodinger's What is Life?
Mm.
You look at that text, there's a lot of the ideas that are being brought out in the FEP in that text originally. Um,
Yeah, he brings up
a lot of the ideas go back, but
yeah,
are
yeah.
largely ignored because they're very much opposed to the kind of neo-Darwinian canon that we have now in biology, where we're really looking at population level analysis, and you're not looking at physical exigencies or structural exigencies of biology, at the physical systems involved in biology and what kinds of necessities need to be there for life to exist. Um, and then connecting that up to a view of cognition as fundamentally oriented towards action and interaction with the environment too. I mean, that's also there. So there's a lot that's philosophically rich that is associated with the FEP in how the FEP is discussed. It's not necessitated by the FEP. The FEP is just math, but it's math that allows us to conceptualize of things in a particular way. It's also cool math. It's fun math. Part of it is there's a lot of flourish to that math that doesn't need to be there. That's just it. Just if you like math, it's cool, and you can keep pushing it in new cool directions. It's kind of it's like this magpied. You just it's like a bunch of shiny math taken from 18 different distinct feel. You know, you've got some of it's machine learning math. Like some of it just is elbow, right? To minimize free energy, the quantity known as free energy as a kind of information theoretic construct, to minimize free energy is to just optimize the evidence lower bound, which is elbow, which is a machine learning technique, right? It's also Fokker-Planck, or the master equation, or the Kolmogorov-Ford equation, which is, you know, a principle of StatMech. It's also I connected it up to maximum entropy principle, which is a sort of Jaynes put forward this idea that we can view basically the core principles of thermodynamics expressed statistically can also be reoriented as a kind of epistemic principle for like keeping your priors flat, basically, except for when the evidence. Does that make sense?
No,
So
I don't think I got the latter bit of it regarding the epistemic principles. Yeah.
yeah, so Jaynes in the is this 50s? Maxent. Jaynes.
I'll look.
When's the first Maxent paper? 50s, right? Yeah, it's the 50s. 57. It's 57. Um, yeah, so the idea is that
Yeah. Yeah, 57. That's right. Yeah, yeah. E.T. James, two papers.
so it's like a closed thermodynamic system. The principles of thermodynamics tell us that a closed thermodynamic system will max out its entropy, right?
Yeah.
Like that's This is what thermodynamics
At a
tells
certain
us,
point, yeah, of course.
right? Ultimately, in the limit. You can give this a gloss as a principle for best inference. Like it's already probabilistically formulated, but then view that as a rule for governing the probability distribution over some belief. And it's again maxent because your priors need to be as flat as the probability distribution is as flat as it can be given the evidence, right? So there's
Okay. And you're saying the FAP does bring in this into its theorizing too, like
they did. I don't think they did. I think I pointed it out and then they started to. So their recent work is actually explicitly incorporating the Janes stuff.
okay, fascinating. Yeah,
But I think it was actually because I was like, so Janes, right?
that's fascinating. I didn't know that because I mean I mostly view it through predictive coding and Bayesian reasoning. I mean
Yeah.
really that's
Well, I actually doubted that lineage.
oh okay I
I
see.
doubted that lineage, but I thought that they'd made that connection explicitly beforehand. But the people who are now explicitly doing the max and incorporating with FEP
Yeah.
are attributing it to me. So I'm like, it's if he wants,
Okay.
sure,
Yeah.
I'll take
Are
it.
there any, because like I mean I'd love to read up on this. Are there any papers? Because I mean I've only just started on the book. This is like
I
kind
think
of
the best. Okay, so Tom Parr is fucking excellent, but
he's
and Joe Pizzaro,
right. Yeah.
all those people who wrote that book are excellent, but I think
Very good writers too. Yeah.
the most competent mathematician who's working within the free energy framework is Dalton Saktivarivel.
Okay. I gotta how do I spell that?
Do you know
Dolt?
how to spell Tamil names? Yeah,
Oh me
Dalton.
oh
The
perfect.
first name's very Scottish, which is easy, but
Well. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
um, so actually
That's
they took it from so they took the max and like so I proposed like, hey, well, what the FEP is kind of is you're taking principles of statistical mechanics and you're epistemicizing them. You're giving them an inferential reading. You're
mm,
taking laws of
mechanics.
statmech
Yeah.
and you're reading them as principles for
Cognition.
best
Yeah.
inferencing.
Yeah.
Statistical.
I mean, I'd say for me, initially, when I came across the FAP, that's what I found quite interesting, where, Carl Friston, his background's even in physics, and like you take from statistical mechanics, which is in physics.
I think he did a bachelor's in physics in like the 60s.
Yeah, I shouldn't say background, you're right. I think he studied physics. He certainly is a neuroscientist, but like I think he
Because
does
like the physics he's getting is largely
outdated. Or
well, I think he's just drawing from a lot of areas of
mm,
physics.
mm, mm, mm.
Um, and
Polymath.
but really it's like he's in clinical neuro, right? He's spent a career in clinical neuroscience.
Well, I mean, generally, what interested me was that the fact that you take these theories and principles from physics, like all from statistical mechanics, or as you point out, like Maxent, and then apply them to move to like cognition, reasoning, Bayesian inference, and the likes. I don't know. I find that fascinating, and I don't know. I just feel like I again as a neophyte, it just excites me to see where the developments goes on the FAP and the the concomitant more engineering work that comes along with it. Having said that, Mel, one thing is this in your paper you say the math is not the territory. And I think here's where we get to the really the crux of the argument, the philosophy of this paper. And I'm just going to read out a bit of an excerpt. I think it's valuable for the listener in case they haven't read it already. Which if you're interested in the FAP or ML for that matter, I highly recommend reading this. So you claim here, I think this is from the abstract. I'm not sure. anyway, I've got this excerpt here. Conceptual reification is a common ailment of scientific modeling. It is particularly likely to occur in cases in which models have somewhat convoluted histories. Reification involves, and here's the important bit, in fact, reification involves mistaking an aspect of a model, its structure, its construal, or the union of both, for an aspect of the empirical of the natural world, mistaking the map for the territory, so to speak. So yeah, could you please elaborate on that bit, the little statement, and then kind of connect that to the FEP?
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency to um conflate scientific realism with realism about the conceptual tools that we use in science. So I'm a full-blooded scientific realist. I think,
So am I.
albeit a pragmatic realist.
Yeah. I'm somewhat of a
I
Kantian.
think I'm more of a realist than most people who call themselves pragmatic real. I think people who call themselves pragmatic realists, I'm like, you're not really a realist. I'm actually a realist, just pragmatically so. Um,
No, I mean,
but
I would say science, without a doubt, it does give us truths about reality. I mean, in
yeah,
sense, I'm
and
a realist, in the Kantian sense, let's say. Yeah.
yeah, whatever the truth, knowledge, whatever the epistemic goods of science are, I want to say it's truth sub pragmatic or knowledge sub pragmatic, right? I think it's not absolute, all encompassing, omniscient truth about nature. It's pragmatic truth. It has its limits,
Mm-mm.
and it's oriented towards us as the kinds of beings that we are, having to occupy the world and navigate it the way that we do, right? But I think it is truth. I mean, if anything is truth or knowledge, that's what
Yeah,
that
with
is.
all those exactly with all those caveats, it gives us truths, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But then we introduce all this conceptual machinery into science to be able to do science. Like the idea of a Hamiltonian, or the idea of a gravitational field, or the idea of a fermion, or the idea of, you know, a force function. And that includes all the Fokker-Planck equation. That includes all the sort of mathematical infrastructure too. These are all the conceptual tools of science. And I think that there's a lot of slippage that's like, well, science delivers truth, therefore all the conceptual tools we introduce in the process of doing science and getting to that truth are also true and real in some sense. And I'm like, no, that requires a lot of careful work at the end of the day. At the final kind of interpretive stage of a scientific procedure, you ask yourself, do we think strings are real? Do we think that quantum fields are real? Do we think that Hamiltonians are real? Or was this just sort of a calculational device? And I think there's a lot of in between it's real and it's a calculational device. But I don't think at the end of the day that's a distinction that can be fully upheld. But there's a tendency, and I think it's true even among careful philosophers, to attribute realism or truth to try to make the conceptual tools of science truth apt when they ought not to be read as truth
Yeah,
apt.
when it's a th thing itself. I mean, it depends, right? For instance, I've spoken to a few mathematicians on this podcast. One person who I can that comes to mind is Joel David Hamkins. Now, he's a Platonist, so for him, of course, yes, FAP, if it's a mathematical structure, it could really exist in like a Platonic sense. But in your paper, you're talking more in regards to our physical world, what science studies. You're not talking about like a Platonic realm. I mean, I don't know what your views are on
Yeah.
Platonism,
So with
but
with math, I think there's a lot of accounts of how math works in science that are, whether explicitly or not, deeply committed to Platonism, or something akin to it. And for me, I'm like, if your account of how natural science works depends on assuming the most kind of industrial strength metaphysics possible, it's not a good account of natural science. Like I believe in naturalism. I'm a naturalist. And a lot of naturalists, a lot of proclaimed naturalists happen to also be Platonists. And I'm like, that's not real naturalism,
Yeah.
right? You need an account of science that assumes as little in the way of metaphysics as possible and is cognizant of what metaphysics it does assume to the extent that you can't get away from that.
Mm, yeah, which
Um,
is why you mentioned all the presuppositions that your realism is based on, right? Right? Yeah.
for me, it's like the word dog or the word mitochondrion, right? Do we think the word dog exists? It's like, I think dogs exist.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that there's a class of natural entities that is well carved out by our best science, and we refer to it via this concept that has this label attached called dog.
Yeah.
But I think the word exists as a cultural mental artifact, but I
It's
don't think it exists mind
signified.
independently.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel the same about math and science. It's
I think
like,
yeah, sorry to interrupt, Mel, but I think I agree with you. I mean, I'm still I hate to use this like cheap like agnosticism, but I'm kind of agnostic as to mathematical Platonism, although because I kind of view it in I think Jean Piaget said that, yeah, if you think about it, all of mathematics is just it's semiotics and linguistics. The thing though is that it kind of does it has to blow our minds as to how consistently it's worked. I mean, at a pure pragmatic level, it is rather bizarre that there's this internal consistency in mathematics. So I'm still
unreasonable efficacy.
exactly, yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't necessarily say that therefore that can be true in some fundamental metaphysical sense, but it does make one wonder. Yeah. So back to the idea, in the paper, I kind of want to also discuss in this paper also you do. Oh, I think I made a mistake there. I'm confusing papers. Do you in the math? It's not the tertiary. Do you discuss uh the natural selection? Like you kind of contrast or juxtapose the FEP with natural selection, or could it be the other paper you wrote, which was more like an introduction to the paper, the free energy principle, an accessible introduction to its derivations, implications, and applications? Uh,
I don't know. Good question. It
yeah,
might be both.
yeah, because
Possible.
regardless, what I also liked was, and this probably connects to my initial question, why a lot of philosophical interest in the FEP. It's just yeah. So like the FEP is it like a meta narrative or like a meta theory, or let's call it a super theory, not a meta theory, a super theory, something like natural selection,
Yeah,
and
or like almost an intuition pump
yeah, I think I prefer that because you
in
can't
the
really, it doesn't really fall into the Popperian falsifiability and in that rigorous sense, right?
I should say maybe in it that was sort of a I'm sort of adapting the Dennett concept. That's not exactly that's not how he uses it, but one could say it's an intuition pump in a stretch of that terminology.
I see.
In that, it's it's a kind of conceptual framework that enables us to think about things very differently in science, but it's not a method, it's not a formal model, it's not a theory or a hypothesis or there are all these sorts of there are all these conceptual tools in science, and it's not any of the kind of lower order conceptual tools of science, in the same way that natural selection is not. I don't view it as a theory. Natural selection isn't a theory or a hypothesis or a model or I
Mm,
mean, it's really sort of a meta conceptual framework, I would say.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think
in that sense, it's very far removed from the actual day-to-day work of science
Of scientist. Yeah, yeah.
and experimental work, for
Yeah,
instance.
yeah. And I think in part 1.5, you essentially say, I propose here that we reserve the free energy principle to denote only the maths of which the FEP is composed. Models utilizing this formalism to study natural systems bear also an interpretation, lending a means of interpreting the maths as about the systems in nature. So, I mean, that idea of, yeah, it's kind of formalistic conceptual structure. I like thinking of it that way. Excellent. So, okay, let's see. In terms of time, yeah, we've got a few more. Is it okay if you go for about 10 more minutes? Or
Yeah, yeah, totally.
fine. All right, fantastic. Thank you, Mel. I kind
And I'm
of
happy to chat again at some point if that's.
yes. I mean, in
I
fact,
just have to run at like, I have to run in 15 minutes, but
yeah, just 10 more minutes of your time, only because one thing I really try to do with this podcast is I don't want to say bridge, but I try to bring into dialogue so-called continental philosophy and more of the analytic philosophy that kind of you work through.
I should say I studied with Dennett in my undergraduate, and it was forbidden to me to touch continental philosophy.
Yeah, you see, this is case in point, and I don't like that, to be honest. I don't even like creating this demarcation. Really, it's just philosophy. It's just thinking. A philosopher is a philosopher, as far as I'm
But see,
concerned.
he knew my mind, and he knew what reading Foucault would have done to me, and it was nothing good.
Yeah, there you go. You start talking about the epistemes and and all of that. Yeah. But what's fascinating is like look at how much of fruitful, productive output you've had, if I may, because you do take in the sociological aspects that Foucault, perhaps above all, point out very carefully when it pertains to our knowledge and epistemology. But yeah, on that note, so let me just ask a very, very broad general question, Mel. As a philosopher of AI, as a philosopher of science, what insights do you think us in the, let's say, Anglo-American, I'm in Australia, you in the are you Canadian, or are you in the US?
US.
US, right? So yeah, the Anglo-American kind of
Well, I drove to
analytic.
Canada this week.
Yeah, there you go. The more analytic, oriented philosophy, which and I spoke to this philosopher called Simon Critchley. He said it's more for just a historical phenomena. It has nothing to do with really with ideas per se. It was just how things changed with World War II, and how that certain analytic philosophers had certain political views. It was more of a political phenomena more than a philosophical phenomena in history. But be that as it may, yeah, as a philosopher of AI and philosopher of ML, what insights do you think we can gain from kind of the discourse within continental philosophy, with thinkers all the way from thinkers like Heidegger to people like Zizek, and to sociologists like Foucault?
Um, I don't delve into that work very much, but I know people who do, and they, I think, make very interesting work of it. Elmer Feiten is more
Okay, I
doing
haven't
some
heard.
philosophy of the eye
Yeah, thank you very
is
much.
more continentally
Okay,
influenced.
I haven't heard of that person. Fantastic. Okay, thanks for that.
Um, he will know other people.
Yeah. I'll
There's
speak.
also some, I think there's a way in which sort of STS scholarship on technology, AI, ML, um, is also more continentally leaning
Mm-mm-mm.
in
Well,
some
there's
ways.
this book that I've just started on called The Critical Theory and AI,
Oh,
which
cool.
I'm hoping to speak to. It's by Simon Lindgren. I just started on the book, so I can't really say much on it. It was just published last year. which
Yeah,
yeah,
we just put out
continental.
this the pseudoscience paper. Um,
Okay.
and a lot of the reviewers were suggesting some sort of like critical theory
Oh, you mean the
literature
one,
that,
the ghost in the machine learning paper? I see.
yeah, our reviewers were suggesting some of that stuff.
Fascinating. Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, which is like for me, and leaving aside the names, like just generally for you, as you pointed out, Dan had said, no touching continental philosophers, but just I'm curious, well, why did you rebel against your, I'm joking here, of course, but your master's commands and kind of get interested in, because I've seen through your Twitter feed, for instance, that you do retweet stuff by some continental philosopher or by Zizek, or you aren't totally averse to it or opposed to it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think
what
the
about value
divide is,
we have in the
sorry.
discourse, in the philosophy of,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think again the divide is pretty superficial,
I couldn't agree.
as you
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
you said. And I think as I said, like with everything, most of everything is this is again uh um a Dennetism, but 99% of everything is crap
Yeah,
was his line.
yeah,
And I think that's true of both analytic and continental philosophy. There's a dominant tradition. There are aspects of, like, if we think of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy as methods, I think there are really problematic features of both of those methodologies as methodologies for philosophy. I think there are really sort of stultifying features of both of those methodologies. And there's brilliant work, there's brilliant ideas coming out of both traditions. But in a way, it's working against some of the kind of primary tendencies of those traditions, in a sense. Um, and so in my work, I'm just trying to say something interesting that matters for the reality we live in, and I'm trying as much as possible not to be operating within a particular conception of what good thought is. I mean, I think thinking according to some conception of what is the right way to think is not a right way to think. Um, I think it keeps us short of discovering truths. Um, so I try to not adhere as much as possible to principles of particular genres of philosophy, in so much as I can do that and still get published enough in philosophy venues to
yeah,
get a job. But
yeah. That's a whole other conversation. Just on a side note, Mel, are you familiar with the thinker Byung-Chul Han?
no.
Yeah, so he wrote this book, Psychopolitics. Where is it? He's quite big in Germany. He's a German philosopher. In fact, no, he's originally from South Korea, but now he works in Germany. And when I read your paper, in fact, when I read your the theory free paper, the theory free, sorry, the theory free ideal paper, and then also the recent one, the pseudoscience one, he has one chapter in this book, Psychopolitics, on big data. And he wrote
Okay.
this in like the early 2000s. A lot of this, I'd love to, in fact, as since you said it, you'll be open to another conversation. I'd love to kind of discuss. It's just like 15 pages, that chapter. That just his ideas on it, because I think you'd be the perfect person to comment on it, with your kind of analytic background, with yeah, with the work you've done, because it really did remind me of his ideas when I read that when I read your work. In any case, but yeah, again, I want to be cognizant of your time. So just one last question, Mel. what would you say currently? I just like asking this because it kind of excites me as to where what kind of work I should do in this field space of philosophy of ML and philosophy of AI. Apart from what we've discussed so far, what other avenues for research do you think people should look into and take into consideration and start thinking about?
Oh God, there are a million. I think there are a million avenues that are pursued or could be pursued that I think are kind of fruitless. But there are a million avenues that are really fascinating. So, I mean, I think the way machine learning technologies are being adopted and changing labor and changing the way these technologies are changing our relationship to the sort of resource consumption, to the means of production, to the output of labor, to the output of intellectual labor, or epistemic labor, one might say, which are, I think, much more subtle than we've given credit to so far. The way this problem of like opacity or explainability or what have you, I think it's clear that the sort of research avenues that we've been on with that are deeply flawed, and the kind of technologies we've invented to tackle those problems, in so much as they are problems, are deeply flawed. But figuring that out is hugely important. How these technologies are bringing about harms in the real world is
Mhm.
a tremendous issue, and tackling that in a way that is deeply cognizant of incentive structures, right? And investing in interventions that those in the positions of power to create and deploy these technologies would actually be incentivized to adopt, right? And working on that incentivization.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So this
yeah.
requires a vastly interdisciplinary perspective. This requires having whatever the domain of application is, if that's a hospital, if that is in, biological science, if that is in building cell phone applications, if that is it, whatever the application is, having deep domain knowledge of that application, having knowledge of the regulatory structures or lack thereof, having knowledge of the incentives of those who are creating these technologies and deploying them, and having knowledge of the knowledge level of those who are creating these technologies and deploying them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's like now is the time when we need to stop messing around and start doing really, really good, really dialed in interdisciplinary work and supporting that, because you cannot effectively prevent or remediate the ill usage of these technologies from a single disciplinary background. You need teams of people with expertise in a lot of different domains
Yeah.
who know how to talk to each other.
Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, sorry, I lied. That was the penultimate question. This is the last question, and then I'll let you go, I promise. Because you spoke about kind of the social harms, one other question I wanted to ask from you was, we spoke about science fiction and, you know, kind of the dooms kind of mentality. But would you say the current paradigm of AI, the current technologies we have, that it can be compared to something like the nuclear bomb in the nukes in the 20th century? Or do you think that's an exaggeration, or I'm just being dramatic? Like, we aren't there yet. It's not that grave.
Well, the the impact of nuclear bombs, the impact of nuclear technology was in one part the reality of this groundbreaking technology that made killing and destruction possible at all new levels. And in another part, it was a psychological phenomenon. It was almost more radically a psychological shift, right? I think the thing with machine learning technologies and any possible future development of these technologies, in fact, not just what we have right now in front of us, is there's that almost that level of psychological reaction to what these technologies mean, but the disruptive force is not owing to a really radical scientific or technological breakthrough. It's
Well put. Well put.
it's more the psychological and
Yeah.
social
In like
dynamics.
a kind of a socio-symbolic understanding of it. Yeah. Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I
Perfect.
mean, it has the potential to really radically disrupt labor markets, and it already is. But that was something that was already happening.
Yeah. And that'll always happen.
Workers were already being
Yeah.
pushed out. I mean, that was happening since the Industrial
Yeah.
Revolution.
Yeah. And
That
that's just
machines.
capitalism. Yeah. That's just capitalism. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just that now there's an even more. It's perpetually a more and more urgent
Fascinated.
need
Oh,
to
yeah.
shift away from a mode of production in which if you don't work, you die.
Mm.
You know, the world in which if you do not labor, you starve to death is not one that works, in which most people are being automated out of their jobs.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Regardless of the technology. Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Well, yeah. Well, on that grim note, thank you very much for your time, Mel. I've thoroughly enjoyed. I've learned a lot from you, but also just your Twitter feed is fantastic. I visited, I frequent it often. I hate Twitter. I think it's a terrible place, but I
Same.
go to like yours, and I've got like 5 people bookmarked. I just visit their feeds. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, Mel, and I hope we can chat again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. Yeah, I'm happy to follow up and send me the uh Korean German author.
Yes, the one by Byung-Chul Han. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll send you I've got a PDF. I'll send you the PDF, and all that because I love to kind of follow up on that and see what ideas you have. But yeah, thank you, Mel.
Yeah, thanks.